I'm mainly here as a representative of Byzantine studies without any of the massive expertise in this field that Giulio brings, but perhaps a sounding board in which I will shamelessly riff off the amazing papers that have been presented over the last 2 days to bolster my own subject-specific and medievalist knowledge. Giulio, do you mind if I start by asking you something that has really struck me over the last few days, and that I've also found to be very visible in your own work, some of which you very kindly shared with me, is the way in which nature and the environment seems to function so readily as a mirror in which whatever present we're in reflects its own concerns. For the Byzantines, to crudely summarize much more nuanced papers, a reflection of the divine order in the world and of God's providence. For us, perhaps the increasing sense of our own vulnerability and fragility when we look at the natural world and see its degradation as a consequence of industrialization. Is that something that you think informs your own work? And what do you think?
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And I'm sort of humbled by the fact that I'm speaking to all of you in this context. And I've written a book on water, and I have to confess I've actually referred to a number of studies that many here have published. So I'm in debt to this community for whatever understanding I've been able to develop on these topics. I should also say, Rebecca, before I answer your question, there's also a personal reason why I'm here. I had the good fortune through my partner, Andrea Matelo, who happens to be a Byzantinist as well. I had the good fortune of meeting Ruth Macredis a few times, including having a lovely dinner at home in St Andrews, where, as it turns out, we did talk a lot about environmental issues. So it feels particularly apropos that we have a chance to discuss this topic today. Well, just a few thoughts, maybe. I was listening to Christina Sessa's paper with great interest, and I was wondering, if a 30th century historian were to look back on today, what would they make of the discussions that we are having about environmental issues? And if you were to, assuming that documentary evidence were to survive, 10 centuries, you'd probably get the impression that there's a real renaissance in environmental concern right now. We have massive international organizations and massive international meetings coming up in Kunming in China on biodiversity. We have, for those of you who are in Scotland, in Glasgow in November, we'll have the UK government sort of hosting this massive conference of parties of the UNFCCC. And there's a real efflorescence, I would say, of identifying in the environment the purpose of existence of institutions. Larry Fink, the CEO of the largest investment fund in the world, sends a little note to his investors every year, and for the last couple of years running, he's made climate change and environmental concern ostensibly the focus of his work. Really, that's the purpose. Profit is a sort of means to an end, but that's the purpose. I've participated in the last decade in the creation of countless green growth plans for countries. They're sort of abundant. So again, if you were that 30th century historian digging through the libraries, you'd probably find these sort of pieces of paper describing the future of these nations. And then, of course, you'd have the modern day sort of Joan of Arc, Greta Thunberg sort of, pictured on all these kind of icons, modern icons, sort of telling you that the environment is kind of the fundamental concern of modern society. And so the question that I was reflecting on is, what would you make of it, 10 centuries hence, if you were looking back on this, Rebecca, if you were there? And well, two things. And obviously, we know what is going on in the sort of planetary system, in a sort of scientific episteme, as Christina was mentioning. But do we really know what is going on in the human system as clearly as we think? Does all that rhetoric really reflect kind of an identification with environmental issues? And I'll just say two things here. One is, interestingly, that historian would notice that this has happened, this excitement, this renaissance in environmental concern has happened before. If the resolution of the documents would allow it 10 centuries hence, they would see that, starting around the oil crisis in the 1970s, there was this massive concern with the environment. In fact, Americans on the call will celebrate Earth Day. There was a time when Earth Day was a moment when the whole US would stand still in the 70s because of the concern of the planet. You know, we had the Club of Rome, you know, the sort of limits to growth story at the end of the 1970s. We had the Brundtland Commission in '87, which was all about the sort of limits to growth and sustainable development. Actually, that's when sustainable development started. And you had, you know, Rio, of course, 1992. For those of you who follow these things, in 1992, there was a massive conference in Rio that sort of started what turned out to be the Kyoto Protocol and all of that. And so the papers would accumulate. But if you were a paleoclimatologist looking at that same period, you would see no change in the fundamental chemistry of the atmosphere, or the fundamental chemistry of the planet. It would keep continuing to grow carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels as if nothing was happening. That rhetoric has literally no impact on what is happening on the ground. Now, if you then fast forwarded and you went to 2010, you know, in 2010 there were these two massive events you'd have some record of. In North America, there was a massive flood in Nashville, in the Cumberland River, piece of the tributary of the Mississippi. A couple dozen people died. It was a very, very significant, in fact, the biggest event of the century in that part of the world. 2 months later, there was a similar event in magnitude, you'd say, on the Indus. 15 million people were affected and several thousand people died. Now, the difference between the two events is massive, but has nothing to do with environmental conditions, different environmental conditions, everything to do with the difference in the human systems. If you were this last point, and then I'll close this kind of little blurb here, but you know, the UK, you'd find a journal, a magazine saying the UK is celebrating reducing its emissions from 1990 to today by 50%. But of course, that was the result of industrialization, and all that's happened is the UK has actually exported all of its emissions somewhere else. And again, you wouldn't find any sign of any of these any of these documents in the sort of actual paleoclimatic record in terms of changes in the emission. And then you get to today, where indeed you'd find a change in carbon emissions due to COVID, right? So COVID, which has nothing to do with any of our commitments to environmental causes, has actually had a bigger impact on our trajectory today than any of the last 40 years of initiatives. Now, I don't want to end today and this conference on a down note, but it's just to say that, you know, the concern that was just raised about how do we know what's going on, and the sort of, integration of scientific and human sort of narratives is as a problem today as it is for historical issues. And that's one of the kind of big reflections that I've taken in listening to folks is just how current the critiques and techniques that historians use, how current they are for also our current, current predicament.
Totally fascinating. And I suppose, yes, as a historian of the Middle Ages, I'm very used to thinking about the constant problem of how representative our sources are. I suppose I've never made the inversion there, that says in a world where we seem to be bombarded with innumerable quantity of data about what people think, we may in fact face exactly the same challenge.
Yeah, I think we do. It's exactly, that's not to say, to be clear, I'm not claiming that nothing's going on the planet, or all of that is true within the context of our scientific episteme, but our understanding of what we're responding and how we're responding is really quite difficult to parse. We don't really know what's going on. Now, you're a historian, so we spent a couple of kind of days thinking about historical narratives. What do you think is the role of historians and historiography in sort of informing the present? You know, what's your response to kind of this?
That must be every historian's least favorite question, right? That point where we have to step out of the library and tentatively the classroom and commit to something. It is something, however, that I have been thinking about over the course of this conference, and also a little bit further sort of personal context to this conversation. As I recall, Leslie can correct me, But the idea for this chat also arose from a previous spring symposium where Giulio and I were sat next to each other at the after show party. And I had recently come back from a conference on the history of Telangana, the most recently created federal state in India. And so Leslie sort of went, you should talk to Giulio, he works in India a lot, he works on water. And it was an incredibly interesting conversation. And one of the things that had really stood out for me that I didn't know what to do with before talking to you was the fact that at this conference on the history of Telangana, very much a kind of grab bag of papers, the state is trying to establish its own sense of cultural identity and history. So it could best be described as 2 days of papers about all the ways in which Telangana is historically awesome. Had included at least 2 presentations by the Medieval Stepwell Association of Telangana, who are a fascinating bunch of volunteers constituting civil engineers, construction workers, historians, and archaeologists who are committed to renovating and putting back into use the mostly 13th and 14th century stepwells that were built all over this semi-arid state by mostly kings, but also religious organizations, as a way of solving the current water problems that Telangana faces, or at least ameliorating massive drought that strikes the state at various points. And I remember sitting through that as in this dark auditorium, air conditioning full on, because that's how conferences are run in Telangana in what would have been February when I was there, and thinking, I've never seen anything quite like this in coming out of Byzantine studies or Western medieval studies. And part of that, I'm very aware, is because of very, very different regulations about the involvement with historical artifacts and historical sites. Part of it is no doubt my own ignorance, and I sincerely hope that there will be people from the audience saying, no, there's an amazing project to revive Kannats in parts of West Asia. But it really made me think hard, and I've come back to that ever since, and again over the last couple of days in relation to your question. This issue of where our responsibilities stop. I don't think as historians we are responsible for getting out there and fixing the weirs and the canals and the rest of it, although if we inspire people to, that's wonderful. But also where our imagination can take us as historians. It would not have occurred to me to do that had I not seen that paper in Telangana, those papers, in fact. And there is a simplistic argument that says if we mine the past hard enough, there will be stuff we simply haven't thought of. There will be responses to the environment that we haven't thought of, that I think is valuable, even though it is straightforward and simple. I absolutely loved Archie Dunn's paper on Sunday, just for making us rethink the ways in which environmental resources can be thought of differently from a historical perspective. And I think particularly tying up right now with debates about whether or not states should consider environmental assets as a part of their GDP and calculations of wealth, the ways in which he makes the case for the incultum having been not just a core resource of people and the state, but a well-recognized and managed resource, was very thought-provoking. But apart from that simple or simplistic argument that you find stuff from the past and you apply it in the present, I also wonder how much the narrative of past resilience and of past response, rather than the sort of slightly despairing narrative that goes everything bad that is happening has happened before, can also be a great source of hope that we as historians can offer to the future. On one hand, it's terribly depressing that however many people died in the 542 and subsequent events of plague, and however much we may debate how many they were, are largely completely unknown to the general public. That's a little upsetting, I feel, for us all as egotists. But on the other hand, it happened. It was clearly some scale of devastating for at least individuals, possibly for parts of society. And yet here we stand. On we go. The world continues. And I think in between the narrative of the plague as nothing very important and as totally devastating, or indeed the climate event of 536, there is a reality in the middle. So too between our suffering and our lives mean nothing at all because in 1,000 years no one will remember, and history exists solely to sort of remind us of the importance of individual lives, is something about our existence in a continuity of human experience in communion with nature and the environment that is potentially quite powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, this is getting philosophical in a way that probably exceeds my competencies, but I think you're right. And, one of the things I wanted to say in the context of this point is that, there's this, paper that I don't know if he's still on, but Jim Crow gave on the Byzantine, on the Byzantine, aqueducts. And one of the things that struck me listening to that, I had read the book, incidentally. He may be alarmed to hear that his work is actually quite popular outside of historical circles in the practitioner's world. It struck me that there's another way in which sort of history really matters, at least to me as a practitioner, right? There's, somebody mentioned E.O. Wilson earlier. E.O. Wilson had this wonderful saying about biology, which I think applies to our governance of environment and of water specifically too. He used to say of biology, we have godlike technologies, medieval institutions, and Paleolithic emotions. And that's true also of the management of water, certainly, and also environment. And, the Valence Aqueduct is a great example because that story is actually a recurring story through the ages. The Valence Aqueduct is not the only example that you can pick of a society dealing with perfect locations but bad water sort of conditions in that way. And I'm reminded of a couple of instances where that godlike technology gets adopted 2,000 years later. Some of you will know that Manchester in the 19th century got its water from Lake Thirlmere in the Peak District. And this was a time when people started realizing that water had something to do with cholera. And they developed Lake Thirlmere and created one of the longest aqueducts in the world to do exactly what Constantinople did so many years earlier, bring clean water to the city, several hundred kilometers away. And similarly, New York today has exactly the same setup that Constantinople had. The water that New York City, Manhattan, uses comes from 400 kilometers away in the Catskills, in a protected watershed that sort of might look like the Belgrade Forest next to Istanbul in many ways. And the same is true for, incidentally, Mexico. It's true for Mexico City, for Sao Paulo, for Quito, Ecuador. I mean, all across the world, there are contemporary societies that deal exactly in the same way. Now, the fascination is not so much with the technology, though, but with the thing that maybe because of sources is hard to talk about in the Byzantine context, which is the real conversation at the time in the 19th century or in the 20th century in New York or wasn't actually about the technology. It was about the institutional setup. It was about ownership. Who owns the water and the landscape on which these things get developed? Who gets to access the water? Somebody made the comment about water being public at the time. And it's not a coincidence that a lot of these remote schemes to transfer water from distant locations to a city go hand in hand with modern discussions about the role of the liberal state and the role of local government versus central government in developing the landscape for a nation, the exercise of sovereignty on the landscape. And so I think that on top of sort of the narratives that historians can provide to interpreting our role, place in the universe, there are also these models over time that I think are recurring and that help us understand why we do what we do today. I'm seeing Daniel, so I think we're running out of time in this conversation.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to have to draw this conversation to a close in a second, which is a shame because it's fascinating. But
it could go on all day.
I know. I will open up the session, a breakout room at the very end for people that have questions and comments for this. But I would like to take the opportunity to thank you both, and also for Christina for a very sort of stimulating keynote and a fascinating conversation afterwards. So thank you very much.